Hello, my name is Billy York, and I am a Cloud and Data Center Management MVP, an Azure consultant at 3Cloud Solutions, and my Azure Advent Calendar video is Azure Monitor Workbooks, the new way to visualize Azure. You can follow me on Twitter at scautomation, and my blog is systemcenterautomation.com. First, a little bit of an Azure Monitor overview. I will be going over a lot of stuff within Azure, but this is definitely not a getting started with Azure Monitor. Within Azure Monitor, we have metrics and logs, and we can collect those from applications that are on-prem and within Azure, operating system logs, Azure resources, and your Azure subscriptions and tenants. Within Azure, there's a few different ways to do dashboards. The old way was View Designer, and this wasn't a very good solution. It was kind of clunky and hard to use and not very customizable and had very few widgets that you could actually use. I believe that the View Designer will eventually be phased out, so I don't recommend using it. Next, Azure dashboards are a lot more flexible than View Designer dashboards ever were. They can collect log analytics as well as application insights and metrics straight from your Azure resources. There are a number of different tiles and widgets that you can use, and they recently added the ability to auto refresh on the Azure dashboard. And finally, we have workbooks. Workbooks are my favorite new thing within Azure Monitor. They have parameters that you can set that are dynamic across the widgets as well as text. They have numerous tiles, widgets, heat maps, and can even pull in your Azure resource icons. They can query metrics, logs, Azure Resource Graph, Azure Monitor alerts, and a lot more, and they're adding new features every week. For third-party solutions, we have Grafana, which is essentially like an Azure dashboard to me. It just has different icons and widgets that you can use and can pull in anything from Azure Monitor. And finally, we have Squared Up. Squared Up offers a little more value in my opinion because you can actually query directly from the Azure DevOps API. They have native ServiceNow integration, as well as being able to pull in any metrics or logs from Azure Monitor and your other Azure resources. And they can also query against the Cost API within Azure. Before we get started, we have some best practices to follow in general, and some of these are from the Azure Monitor Workbooks team. The first is keep your workspaces to a minimal amount. Optimize your queries so that you're not pulling in too much data. Essentially pull in the data that you need. And then even though you can create complicated workbooks, the feedback I received was don't make too overcomplicated workbooks. And there's a few workbooks that I've actually seen that will not load sometimes because they are too complicated, in my opinion. To get started, let's look at where all the workbooks are. Because workbooks are so new, they are located in a few different places, and they're kind of hidden in various spots, and I'll show you everywhere that I've found workbooks. There are a number of Azure Monitor workbooks all over Azure, and in this section I'll show you where you can find all of the workbooks that I'm aware of. This current section is under Azure Monitor and the Workbooks tab. Green is for any of your custom workbooks, and purple are the ones provided by Microsoft. You have some for virtual machines, applications, and then down at the bottom you have some for log analytics workspaces. Next, under actual log analytics workspaces, I've gone ahead and installed every available solution for my log analytics workspace just to see what workbooks were available. And you can see that there's actually an Azure Activity one, Azure Data Factory Analytics, Key Vault Analytics, and then Agent Health and Workspace Usage. Next, under Application Insights, this is where Workbooks actually started, so it has the most available. You have a bunch for failure analysis, performance, usage, retention, business hypothesis, and the Azure blockchain one I have no idea about. Finally, coming back under virtual machines in the VM Insights solution, If you click on the virtual machines and then performance, there's actually a workbook section that will load. If you select a workbook and then just go back, or I think you can select from the gallery directly from that drop down, you'll actually see there's a number of network related workbooks and then some more performance analysis workbooks. And then last but not least, under the Azure Monitor page again, we have the storage account workbook. And this is a really cool and interesting workbook that I'll be going over in more detail later in the video. Now let's get started with Workbook Parameters. Parameters are the key features of workbooks for me. They allow you to set things like custom timeframes and subscriptions, or even create custom variables. When we open our workbook, you're greeted with add text, add query, add metric, add parameters. So we'll go ahead and start with that. First, the two most common parameters that you usually see are time frame and subscription. So what I've done here is created a time range parameter, set it to required, and then I set it to allow custom time range selection. We'll save the time range parameter and add a second one for subscriptions. This is another very common parameter you'll see throughout workbooks. Using the subscription picker, we can select all subscriptions that are available to us. We'll also set this one to required and allow multiple selections. And then I usually like to select all and then any one. We'll click Save. Next, I'll show you how you can use Azure Resource Graph to define a parameter. We'll select Resource Picker to define our resources. And then we'll use Query and select Azure Resource Graph. If you're not familiar with Azure Resource Graph, it's the same query language used in Log Analytics and Application Insights. It's very valuable for inventory of your Azure environment. This query runs and grabs all of our Log Analytics workspaces. I'll set required, allowed multiple selections, and then I'll hit Save. Next, we'll do the same thing but for our Application Insights workspaces. Again, we'll use Resource Picker, and then we'll select Query. We'll select Azure Resource Graph again, and then this time I'll use a query that grabs all of our Application Insights workspaces. We run the query, and you can see it's returned my Insights workspaces back. I click Allow Multiple Selections, but I didn't set it to Required. We'll select Done Editing for a second here and go through our subscriptions. So I selected my pay-as-you-go account, and you can see I still have all of my workspaces there. And if I select my Visual Studio account, all of my workspaces are still there. But what if I want to set a parameter for App Insights that only shows when I've selected a specific subscription? We'll go back in and edit our App Insights parameter. The key thing we need to change here to make this parameter dynamic is under the query. We'll click Change, and then click the drop down for subscriptions, and you can see our subscriptions parameter is now there. We'll select that and click Run Query just to make sure it works. We'll hit Save, Done Editing, and now if I select App Insights, we see all of those that are available. But if I change and add the pay-as-you-go subscription, you can see that it adds an additional App Insights workspace. Similarly, if I remove the Visual Studio Enterprise subscription, I just have my one App Insights workspace. The real value in parameters is being able to add them to your queries and widgets. For this query, I'll go ahead and select all my workspaces, and then I'll write a simple query for detecting heartbeat across my computers. The interesting thing about this is that it will automatically query all the workspaces and join the data together. There's no nasty joins or unions that you have to do, it just does it for you. Next, I'll show you a practical example of using parameters within workbooks. You can see I have my workspaces parameter here set to include all my workspaces. I did this because a client needed to consolidate many workspaces all together, and despite my best effort, they would not listen and combine their workspaces. You can see here in the middle, I select any row and the bottom text and the bottom widget change based on which row I've selected. To do this, we need to export a parameter from that middle widget. When we use that parameter, we use bracket and then the parameter name bracket, and this works across text as well as queries. And to export a parameter, we have to click the little gear icon on the widget. And this gives a whole bunch of settings like parameters, but it also will control style and custom pixel width. So we can select when an item is selected, export parameter. And then we can select the field to export. That's the actual column name from our log analytics query. And then we give the parameter a name, and that's what we put in the brackets for any text or any other queries that we want to reference that parameter. There's also different parameter types you can set. In this instance, I'll just leave it blank because it works. We'll click Save. And now our parameter is able to be used throughout the rest of the workbook. Next, I'll show you about metric workbooks. The storage accounts workbook is really cool. I really like it. It's really well designed. It has 3 parameters: subscriptions, storage accounts, and time range. And the 4th parameter is set based on how many storage accounts you selected. So you can see it just changed from 5 to 13 storage accounts after I selected all. It also has 2 tabs, which are also based on parameters, one for overview and one for capacity. So let's take a deep dive into this workbook and see how it was created. As I mentioned, it has 3 parameters that you can set. The 4th parameter is set based on the storage account parameter. Within the Azure Resource Graph query for the parameter, they use the storage accounts parameter and then do a count, and that's how they get the total count and the count that you're viewing for this parameter. Next, let's take a look at how they use parameters to create the 2 tabs. They gave them names and then assigned values for it, and then that value is assigned to each widget. If I haven't mentioned it before, all of the text in workbooks is actually using Markdown. I really like the use of Markdown because it's so simple to style. So you can see here, this is where they made an item conditionally available with the parameter tabs. When the overview parameter is selected, that's when this widget's going to show up. Again, I think this is a really cool and neat use of parameters to define tabs. Now, let's talk about metrics. Any metric that's available for an Azure resource is available in Azure Monitor, and thus it's available in Azure Monitor workbooks. There are also some options that are hidden that you don't see at first within the workbook, and that's what I'm going to show you now. If we click Edit and then Column Settings, at the top you'll notice a Group By section. This is added whenever you set the tree Group By settings at the bottom. You can group by subscription, resource group, or parent-child relationships based on return data from your logs. Next, you'll see here I've got Transaction Timeline. This is actually a hidden metric. If we exit out of this and go take a look at the available metrics, we'll actually see that there are no timeline metrics available. If I select Blob and then Metric, you'll see no timeline metrics available for any of the available metrics. What's interesting is if we go back under Column Settings, the workbook has automatically detected timeline metrics for all of the metrics that we've selected. but they show up as hidden at first. You have to go select it and then actually change the column renderer from hidden to Spark Area or Spark Line or whatever timeline-based visualization you want to use. As you can see, there are a number of available visualizations. I'm not going to go through each one. That would be its own 10 or 15 minute video all on its own. Next up, let's take a look at how you can query Azure Alerts in an Azure Monitor workbook. Alright, so I have this workbook set up already with my time range and subscription parameters. The first thing I'm going to show you is you can actually query Azure Health directly. If we select Azure Health and then we select our Log Analytics workspace, you actually have to click Load Subscriptions. We can select our workspaces here. And then we get a status available, as well as a summary for Azure Health events. Next, let's take a look at Azure Alerts. For this one, we can definitely use our subscriptions and just query everything against it. And after we've run our query, we can see I have a bunch of Sev3 alerts and just a handful of Sev2. But what if we want to see the new and acknowledged and closed? We could change the results to alerts, or we could create a new parameter. And in this case, I'm going to export the severity parameter and give it a parameter name of SEV. Sometimes if you've created a parameter, it might not show up in other widgets until you actually hit save on the workbook. We'll add a second query. And again, we'll select Azure Alerts. Select our subscriptions. And now we should have severity under here as a parameter. And now I'm going to select a few conditions just to differentiate between the top and the bottom widgets. I'll select fired. And I'll select on alert state as well. And then change this to alerts instead of the summary. So you can see we queried against Azure Health Alerts. That's still in preview at the moment. It doesn't have all services. For instance, Application Insights isn't available, and a few other things that I was looking for aren't available at the moment. Then we could have summary view of our alerts, and then we can export that parameter to a bottom widget, and then look at that down here and get the full alert down here. Let's take a look at Azure Resource Graph. In addition to being able to query Azure Resource Graph for your parameters, we can make entire dashboards based on Azure Resource Graph. So now I'm in my Azure Resource Graph workbook, and for the purposes of time, I've already set up things like parameters and a few of the queries with visualizations, but I'll run through and show you how easy it is to create a dashboard with Azure Resource Graph. Something that's really cool is they give you this samples button here, and they give you Azure Resource Graph sample queries that you can use right off the bat. You can click use this sample and it'll add it straight to your query window. For this first tile, it just does a summarize for all the resources within my tenant. I did tile settings, and then I just selected show border around tiles, and then did a big number render. I'll go ahead and cancel out of that and click Done Editing to close our query window. For this next widget or chart, I've got my subscriptions and resource groups by count, and that was also a simple Azure Resource Graph query. And again, to note, this is the same query language used in Application Insights and Log Analytics. It's also used in a number of other Microsoft products as well. So we've got our subscriptions and resource groups counts, and this is a simple grid that was just by default. Now, I could specifically tell it to do a grid, but it's fine the way it is. Also, I noted before, Workbooks will automatically bring in the icons if it can detect what kind of resource it is. It will even pull in the correct resource type icon when you're using Log Analytics if you get the _resource ID field. For the next Azure Resource Graph query, I've got another query that gets a few of the most popular things in my tenant, which would be app services, storage accounts, the normal stuff that people use. And then I summarize them by their count, and then I do a replace on their resource graph name and then give them their common name at the bottom. Again, these were tiles, nothing too difficult to set up. I like the tabs idea from the storage account workbook, so what I did is I created two new additional variables called compute and PAS and gave them the value of selected tab. Now the widgets below I can set as compute or PAS, and they will only show when that specific tab is selected. This next query summarizes a count of VM sizes in my Azure environment. Next, I'll create another new query. We'll select Azure Resource Graph, our subscriptions parameter. I'll also make this conditionally available. I'll paste in my query. Alright, so this brought in the total disk size in gigabytes of all of the VMs that I have in my tenant. And again, to match everything else, I think I'll use tiny, and I will make it a tile. Now, sometimes you might see this. You do have to set the tile settings sometimes for it to render properly. Use our disk size in gigabytes column, and we'll select big number as our renderer. And just to match everything else, we'll put a border around it. Apply, save and close. All right. You can also add titles to our charts right here. The next query I want to show you will provide a summary count of our public IP addresses. Again, I'll make it conditionally available to compute. To get our public IP addresses from Azure Resource Graph, they're under Microsoft.networks/public IP addresses. And then I do a summarize by IP type, which is renaming the field from public IP address version. You can see I have 6. And this time I'll leave it as a grid. And I'm going to set the size to tiny and click Done. We'll add a couple more queries because I want more information on my VMs. This query will get us the size of our disks across the tenants by SKU name and location. And finally, we'll do one more query against our VMs. This query gets our VMs by OS and location and their VM size with the count. So if we click Done Editing and Save, if we click on PAS, all of those queries should go away, but if I click on Compute, they come back. I'll be doing some more refining and modifications to this workbook, but expect to see it on my blog and on my GitHub page soon. And that brings us to the conclusion of my video. We went through workbook parameters and how to use them, metric workbooks, how to query Azure Health and Azure Monitor alerts, Azure Resource Graph. But I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of what's possible. I didn't even show Azure Graph and Azure Maps that you can use in workbooks, or workload health, or how to share the workbooks, which is easily done through gallery templates or ARM templates. And in my opinion, the best way to learn workbooks is to crack open some of the ones that Microsoft has provided. So get started and share your workbooks you've created with the community. Thank you for watching.